Thank you very much. Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Bob Ludwig. I'm the Director of Sales for Alamo in the New England region, and we're very happy to have you all with us. Tonight's presentation is sponsored by the Ford Hall Forum and the Alamo Rent-A-Car Preserve and Protect America Forum, a public affairs program designed to protect the right to freedom of speech and the open exchange of ideas by presenting influential speakers on today's most important community issues. Alamo is pleased to be a benefactor for tonight's presentation, which promises to be an interesting and informative discussion about a topic that is important to all of us: community rebirth and rebuilding, and the preservation of traditional family values. Tonight we are fortunate to have Secretary of Housing and Urban Development Henry Cisneros with us to share his insights into the challenge he faces regularly. In fact, in a recent Boston Globe article, Secretary Cisneros said that one of the most important things HUD has to do is to find ways to re-engage fathers into the lives of their children. A difficult task when combined with rebuilding communities and the need to provide affordable housing for single-parent families. As a member of the President's Cabinet, Secretary Cisneros is America's foremost federal housing and community development official, responsible for administering fair housing activities as well as federally assisted housing and economic development programs throughout the nation. Mr. Cisneros graduated from Texas A&M with a master's degree in urban and regional planning. He also graduated from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard and received a doctorate in public administration from the George Washington University. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Henry Cisneros, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, as he discusses tonight's topic, Will Rebuilding Cities Rebuild Families?
Mr. Ludwig, thank you very much. Bob, I want to thank also Bill Geary, member of the Board of Directors of the Ford Hall Forum, Wendy Ballinger, the Executive Director of the Forum, and Sandy Richards of Alamo, who also played a role in making tonight possible. It's a wonderful honor to be asked to be here in this historic setting in an institution, the Ford Hall Forum, which has existed for some 87 years as a focal point for public information. It is a special honor for me to come back to an area that has been very important in my life. I had the good fortune of living for 2 years with my wife and daughter in this community. We lived in Somerville, an area called Teal Square, 1 year, where we were exposed to the Irish variant of Boston culture, and then the next year in the Winter Hill area of Somerville as students, where we were exposed to the Italian variant of Boston culture. So we're well steeped in Boston culture and lore, and enjoyed those 2 years at the Kennedy School and later at MIT immensely. I understand that the Ford Hall Forum is a continuance of the Lyceum tradition of the turn of the century, when it was thought that libraries and museums and public lectures were important ingredients of the local civic culture. I'm glad to see that this tradition is still alive in Boston. It's my understanding that the Ford Hall Forum is the oldest of these lecture forums, and I congratulate all who continue to organize it. It's especially appropriate, I suppose, that tonight should be sponsored by Alamo Rent-A-Car, since I come from San Antonio, Texas, a city known as the Alamo City. And I grew up in a city where everything was about the Alamo. Every business in town that wanted, first and foremost, to associate itself with that historic place, but I suspect also wanted to capture the A that would put them near the front of the telephone book as well, was named Alamo Printers or Alamo Bookbinders or Alamo Car Repair or every other variant of Alamo. This Alamo is not from San Antonio but from Florida, but I always look at it fondly when I see those beautiful advertisements of Alamo Country, though I must admit it isn't always the deciding factor in the car that I might rent. Hereafter, I suppose it should be. Right. And I guess it is appropriate as well that I should be introduced by Mr. Ludwig, who provided me a rare treat tonight, and that is to introduce me and actually pronounce my name correctly. My name is Cisneros. Pronounced with a Spanish accent, it is Cisneros. But I promise you, it is not the things that I have been called when I have come to places like Boston. On one occasion, I was introduced as Henry Cisneros. It's just not that complex a name. On another, I couldn't quite figure how in the world I was introduced in the way that I was. And then about a week later, I read the feature section of the local newspaper, and there was a story there about how to remember a person's name, memory jogging techniques, it suggested. Focus on a prominent feature on a person's face, associate it with their name, it'll help you remember them. And I understood then instantaneously why I had been introduced the previous week as Henry Cisneros. One of the worst of these introductions occurred in my own hometown. I was mayor at the time. I went over to welcome a convention group one day, a medical group, and as I stood there welcoming the group, this was a Monday morning, they had been through a weekend of medical symposia. It was very clear that the presenter had not learned the host mayor's name, the local mayor's name, my name. I noticed an expression of panic on his face. It's very difficult to get through a whole introduction and never mention a person's name. Tough job. He managed to do it until the moment of truth. He could avoid it no longer. I saw him sort of begin to gather his courage. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, would you please welcome Mayor Sclerosis?" So after you've been introduced by a disease, as a disease, you appreciate someone who's gone to the trouble of mastering the introduction. I said one of the worst, because you'll indulge me for one final example. This actually happened as a result of a lecture series at the National Press Club, and it was covered by C-SPAN, and I got back to the office after lunch, and sure enough, there were some telephone calls with people who agreed and disagreed with things that I had said, and one lady called and she said, I really can't pronounce the secretary's name. And then she must have had a moment of ethnic inspiration, and she made a stab at it. She said, I really can't pronounce his name, but it was something like cheese nachos. So thank you again, Mr. Ludwig, for the introduction. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you tonight about the future of our national government's relationship with cities and its relationship with the people who live in cities. We stand at a historic moment for national urban policy. In the wake of November's elections, the most fundamental questions are being asked about the proper role of the federal government and the extent of our national commitment to our cities and our national responsibility to poor people and poor families. Questions such as how much should we as a nation do to repair the fabric of our urban centers, and especially the communities and neighborhoods which have been left behind by the changes in our national economy? How much responsibility should we as a nation accept for housing the millions of poor and low-income working families who live in these places? How large a role should the government play in comparison to cities and states in dealing with these problems? And what is the fundamental purpose of government in its interrelationship with families and individuals? Many long-standing assumptions about the relationship between federal, local, and state governments are being challenged. And President Clinton believes that in many ways this is healthy. People's minds are open to new ideas and new possibilities, and we have an opportunity to make a clean break with policies and programs that have failed us and to pursue new approaches to old problems. It gives me an opportunity to come here and talk with you frankly about new directions for urban strategy in our country. But the moment, so rich in opportunity, and it is that, an opportunity, is also full of peril. There's danger that in our eagerness to rectify the mistakes of the past, we will ignore the constructive lessons the past can teach us. There's grave danger that in our haste to do something dramatic, we will do something destructive. At this moment, America stands poised between acting on a new understanding of our national responsibility to our cities and urban areas or rejecting its responsibility altogether. We stand poised between renewal or rejection of a national commitment to help millions of people who struggle daily against tremendous odds to feed, clothe, shelter themselves and their children. The acceptance of that national responsibility That national commitment is the essence of the department which the President asked me to head. Today, we hear serious calls for the dissolution of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And those who issue these calls say they simply want to cut government, but what they're really talking about is giving up on some fundamental institutions in our society, the cities. They've looked at our cities, they've seen the serious problems of the cities, and they say, nothing that we've tried has worked. Let's wash our hands of the whole thing. There's nothing more we can do from here. They're drawing the wrong lessons from the past. But how can we draw the right lessons for the future? Well, for starters, I suggest we try standing in the shoes of America's greatest leaders at similarly defining moments in American history. Let's stand on the steps of the United States Capitol with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and imagine the nation as he saw it on January 20th, 1937, the inauguration, his second term. President Roosevelt said on that day, quote, "I see 1/3 of a nation, ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished." Imagine in a nation of 130 million people, more than 40 million living in substandard housing or no housing at all. 1 out of every 3 breadwinners unemployed or underemployed and unable to put food on the table or clothes on their children's backs. President Roosevelt saw all of this and he said, "It is not in despair that I paint the picture for you. I paint it for you in hope, because the nation, seeing and understanding the injustice of it, proposes to paint it out." The nation, under President Roosevelt, did just that. One of President Roosevelt's New Deal initiatives was the Federal Housing Administration, which last year celebrated its 60th anniversary. FHA revolutionized housing finance, opening the doors of home ownership for the first time to average working people in communities across America. Try to imagine what life for families would be like today if we had not made a national homeownership commitment 60 years ago. Today we hear calls for the privatization of FHA. Sell it off, they say. Sell it off to mortgage insurance companies who want an effective FHA stifled, yet who never consistently help lower-income Americans attain home ownership, as FHA has done for 60 years. Stand on the floor of the United States Senate in the years immediately following World War II, when a fierce political battle raged over national housing policy. Listen to the words of Senator Robert A. Taft. In 1946, on the eve of the elections that gave the Republican Party control of Congress, Taft wrote, quote, "I believe that the government must see that every family has a minimum standard of decent shelter, along with subsistence, medical care, and education." Senator Taft, Mr. Republican, fought alongside Democrats of his day for a national commitment to decent, affordable housing, which is the bedrock of healthy communities and the foundation of economic lift for families. And the vision of Taft and his bipartisan allies became a national commitment in the Housing Act of 1949, an act which declared the general welfare and security of the nation require the realization as soon as possible of a decent home and a suitable living environment for every American family. A decent home and a suitable living environment, a national commitment. President Truman, Senator Taft, and other leaders of their day looked at post-war America and saw a terrible housing shortage. They didn't blame the people who needed a hand up. They made a bipartisan national commitment to help them. By contrast, today we hear voices spewing forth the flawed logic of social Darwinism, calling for government's withdrawal from the housing arena, rejecting America's long tradition of steady forward progress in favor of retrenchment and regression. Let's try to see America's cities through the eyes of Lyndon Johnson on the eve of the terrible riots of the 1960s. In March of 1965, in a message to Congress, President Johnson said, "The modern city can be the most ruthless enemy of the good life, or it can be its servant. The choice is up to this generation of Americans." President Johnson went on to say, we want to build not just housing units, but neighborhoods, not just to construct schools, but to educate children, not just to raise incomes, but to create beauty and end the poisoning of our environment. And that year, 1965, with the strong support of the Congress, the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development was born. The nation reaffirmed and strengthened its commitment to our communities and the people who live in those communities. In a bipartisan commitment, Republicans like Senator George Aiken of Vermont and Senator Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania joined Democrats in voting to establish this national commitment at the cabinet level to cities and communities, housing, and urban development. Senator Jacob Javits, Republican of New York, said at the time, quote, "The hallmark of this whole century will be the culture and development of the cities, and the fact that millions of people in close relation to each other can live in comfort and in happiness." A national, bipartisan commitment. In the intervening 30 years, HUD has delivered on this commitment. The Federal Housing Administration, a vital part of HUD, has insured new mortgages and refinanced home loans for 23 million families. Millions of families have become homeowners for the first time. 450,000, 500,000 almost, last year, first-time home buyers, last year alone. More than 7 million people have lived in public housing with HUD's assistance. And despite today's troubling and unfortunately very real images of public housing, it has historically been a starting place in life for many people. Just ask Congressman Louis Stokes or Joe Moakley of Boston, Bill Cosby and Kenny Rogers and Whoopi Goldberg, and athletes Isaiah Thomas and Evander Holyfield, singers Aaron Neville and Diana Ross, businessman Vernon Jordan, labor leader Bob Georgine, journalist Juan Williams of the Washington Post. All of these people got their start in public housing. Nearly 12 million families and individuals, including millions of senior citizens and people with disabilities, have found affordable housing and privately owned, federally assisted housing. Hundreds of communities, thousands of neighborhoods, tens of millions of people have benefited from HUD's programs over the course of the last 3 decades. The national commitment that was renewed and strengthened in 1965 has been honored in communities from border to border and coast to coast. Of course, the record is not unblemished. We have made mistakes, serious mistakes of policy, and we're now coming to see mistakes of method. We concentrated poor and minority families in high-rise public housing developments that have turned into warehouses of poverty and despair. We subsidized private developments and then let them fall into serious disrepair. We insisted that every unit of public housing, vacant or not, had to be preserved, even when it made more sense to tear them down. We piled program on program, rule on rule, regulation on regulation, and enmeshed whole communities in webs of micromanagement. We have too often lost sight of some simple, powerful truths, the core values and original principles that define what America believes about its cities. Let me share with you what some of those core beliefs should be. We believe that government can help poor people best by helping people help themselves. The bottom line of government efforts to help people should be a transition to a better life. Government assistance should not be an ending point, but a starting point. It's the beginning of a dynamic forward movement that leads to self-sufficiency. The housing products we make possible, homeless shelters, public housing, starter homes, are not final destinations. They're stepping stones for advancement. This was the vision of FDR and Truman and Johnson and Javits and Taft. Government programs to help people should free them to make choices about their own lives. Housing assistance, for example, shouldn't tie people down to buildings. It should free them to choose housing in the way most Americans make that choice, on the basis of schools or availability of services or access to recreation, proximity to work. Government efforts to help people should free them from the lethal grip of economic and social isolation. In Chicago, I met a mother, Arleta Jackson, who used to live in one of the most difficult public housing developments in America called Ida B. Wells, one of the grim high-rise public projects that march for miles along State Street on the south side of Chicago. Arleta Jackson told me that she used to fear for her son's life every time he went outside to play. Every time she heard a car backfire, she'd rush to the window, knowing that it was gunfire, fearing that her little boy had been shot. A federally supported rental assistance program freed her to move away from that site to a community called Hoffman Estates, a safe community where there are good schools and job opportunities. Today, she is self-supporting. She works at the telephone company, Ameritech, and her son Jason plays the flute in the school band. They're in the mainstream of American life, moving forward to a better future. We help people best when we help people help themselves. This we believe, and we will build our programs on this belief. We also believe in the importance of community. That's where real change begins and takes hold and flourishes. I learned this fundamental truth firsthand when I was on the city council in San Antonio and then later as mayor, where I saw how a group called the Industrial Areas Foundation helped the people of the city's poorest neighborhoods organize to rebuild their communities. They succeeded. They secured sewers and paved streets and sidewalks and parks and libraries and clinics and streetlights and other improvements because they fought for their communities. And they did the heavy political lifting themselves. Their communities today are thriving. I also learned firsthand, by contrast, the limits of what we can do with big, centralized, bureaucratic organizations. This is a huge country. Its immensity dwarfs the capacity of large, centralized government systems to respond and manage problems at the community level. They're too varied from place to place, and large bureaucracies are never supple enough to adjust to all of the iterations and permutations across the country. There is a tension today in American politics, a major fault line that runs between our long-standing impulse to centralize decisions in big bureaucracies, the essential bureaucratic answer of the last 60 years, and, on the other hand, our desire, our faith of trusting in people at the community level. In sociological terms, it's the tension between dependence and independence, between treating people as passive clients or as engaged citizens, between looking to Washington or looking to each other at the community level, between devotion to set-piece, one-size-fits-all solutions or openness to innovation and creativity, which principally occurs at the local level. In political terms, a convergence of thought on the left and right is emerging from this tension. On the left side of the spectrum are community organizers like those who come from the Industrial Areas Foundation, ACORN, and other organizations. I earned my political eye teeth working with community organizers, a man named Ernesto Cortez, one of the smartest Americans that I know, a disciple of the late Saul Alinsky, who tells us that we must follow what he calls the iron rule of community organizing, and that is never do for someone what they can do for themselves. Imagine that precept coming from the left of the spectrum in America. And to the right, a conservative philosopher, Michael Novak, draws on the 18th century writings of Edmund Burke to direct our attention to the importance of what he calls the institutions of civil society, and especially those of neighborly community life. The little platoons, he says, that makes life human, teach the required social virtues, and supply the necessary moral inspirations and constraints. These ideas, from the left and from the right, converge in community. The concept of community, the place that are our communities. They converge in places like Newark, New Jersey, where a group called the New Community Corporation is bringing jobs and housing and hope to thousands of people. They converge in Philadelphia, where ACORN, Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now, is working with the Delaware Valley Mortgage Company to help low-income working families become homeowners. They converge in the empowerment zones and enterprise communities, such as the designation that was made to Boston, joining community-based and nonprofit organizations and private businesses to help the community. This, we believe, is the heart of community building. And right at the heart of community building are families. Here we find in America today, for a variety of reasons, the breakdown of the American family, the coming apart of the bonds of connectedness that have strengthened these institutions we call nuclear families. It is a sad thing to see the role that government has played in this process. About a year ago, I went to Atlanta, and as I walked through a public housing development, I witnessed across the street a man and his wife and 3 little children. I saw them standing there at dusk, a beautiful Atlanta spring afternoon with the dogwoods blooming and the weather just perfect. And so I went over to visit with the family, and it's an unfortunate thing, but it's a rare thing to see an intact family in public housing. I talked to the man, and in the course of conversation, he said to me, "Well, I do try to come and see my family every day after work." I didn't want to inquire, pry, but he volunteered that this was not a family undergoing difficulty. This was not a family in the midst of a divorce or a separation. It was simply an instance of an individual who could not be with his family because of the rules of public housing, which this department has helped create. We have a rule called the 30% rule, which says that you must pay 30% of your income, whatever it is, as rent. And as your income rises, the rent rises dramatically. In this case, this man had acquired a job, a temporary job, as a construction worker. And he was not comfortable enough that he was going to hold that job, that he wanted to add his temporary job's income to the family rent. Because to do so would be to drive the rent up so high the family effectively would not be able to stay in public housing. So this is a man who wanted to be with his children, but made the decision to come by and see them every day because our government rules made it impossible for him to be able to stay with his family. This is the kind of thing government rules have done and that we're now trying to change. Lord knows there are immense stresses on families. Families in every setting, suburban setting, every other professional families, there are immense stresses. And certainly no one in government ought to take the role of keeping people together who ought not be. That is the more appropriate role of the church and religion and of spiritual guidance and so forth. But we must at least eliminate the barriers to families being able to stay together and live together. One of the things that is the most difficult in our society today as I move about the country is the absence of fathers in many poor communities and public housing settings. I have been to buildings where not one single intact family exists. Every one of the families is a female-headed household, a single mother. And it has occurred to me from time to time, indeed I've had this conversation with our president, that as we give assistance for training and other purposes to men, what we ought to at least require is that they take some responsibility in the raising of their children. If nothing else, a Saturday morning after a work assignment or work program, to just spend time with one's children, sons and daughters, in a recreational program, in a mentorship program, in an arts program, in a music program. But the presence of fathers in the lives of children is critical, and one can see the longing in the eyes of young boys, gang members, who have chosen the gang as a substitute family because it is human nature to gravitate toward authority figures, for young men to gravitate toward male figures in their lives. And frequently the gang leader, the gang group, substitutes for the absence of any other guidance and male role. These are tough subjects, difficult subjects in a society changing as fast as our own. But we must talk about these things, not in a spirit of sanction or heavy intervention into people's private lives, but with an understanding that society cannot work without some of these critical interpersonal relationships. I'm a Democrat. It isn't popular over the years for Democrats to talk about families or family values, or Democrats to talk about father roles in the families and authority figures. But I think we've all come to understand that far bigger than our partisan differences is sort of essential concepts of human nature and essential bonds that make the difference between whether or not we'll be able to live together. So we believe in these essential concepts of humanity, and when we build government programs, we have to take those into account. We also believe that the federal government must protect Americans when injustices of local custom and white-hot heat of local politics threaten to consume their most fundamental rights. This has been the federal government's historic role, and it's been a source of tension in national life throughout our history. I speak now of the role of the federal government intervening to create a climate of rights and opportunity. There's a national debate raging right now, but it is not new. The tension goes back to the founding of the Republic. It was evident when writing the Federalist Papers, number 51, James Madison wrote, "In a free government, the security for civil rights must be the same as for religious rights." He continued, "This view of the subject must particularly recommend a proper federal system to all sincere and considerate friends of government. Justice," wrote James Madison, "is the end of government. It is the end of civil society. It ever has been and ever will be pursued until it be obtained or until liberty is lost in the pursuit." He was defining a role for government in creating a climate of rights and justice, a concept that loses currency in some of the debate we're hearing today in Washington. The tension over the federal role brought on the darkest period of American life, the Civil War. When President Lincoln ended his address at Gettysburg with the immortal words that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth, he was articulating far more than a poetic construction of language. He was affirming a theory of constitutional doctrine, argued by Daniel Webster of Massachusetts against John Calhoun, states' rights concept that the nation was not just a league of sovereign states tied together by a contract, but the Constitution, Webster argued in the 1830s, was this. He said, "It is the government. Is the government the creature of the state, legislatures, or the creature of the people? It is, sir," said Daniel Webster, "the people's constitution, the people's government, made for the people, made by the people, and answerable to the people. We are here to administer a constitution emanating immediately from the people and trusted by them to our administrations. It is not the creature of the state governments." Imagine in 1830s a debate that just as certainly could have been occurring on the floor of the House of Representatives last night. A question of whether the principal entity of government ought to be a series of states to whom authority is granted, or whether there is a place in the quest for justice for the national government. I was over in Faneuil Hall a moment ago and saw that wonderful painting over the stage of Daniel Webster making this precise argument on states' rights in debate with John Calhoun. So that tension between states and overarching national purpose has reverberated in our time as well, and most clearly in the struggle over civil rights. It burst onto the front pages of our newspapers and TV screens when President Eisenhower sent federal troops to Central High School in Little Rock. It flashed across our television screens when President Kennedy sent troops to Mississippi. Martin Luther King spoke to this tension in 1963 on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. We all know his speech, "I have a dream." He said, "I have a dream that one day the state of Alabama, whose governor's lips are presently dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, will be transformed into a situation where little black boys and little black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and little white girls and walk together as brothers and sisters." Interposition and nullification. What can those words that Dr. King uttered possibly mean? For 150 years, those ideas framed the debate about the respective roles of the federal government and the states in the most human and profound ways. Interposition, the relationship between the federal government and the states. Nullification, the right of the states to nullify rules from the national government. Today, that same interplay between the constitutional roles and civil rights still courses through our national life. More than a quarter century after the passage of the Fair Housing Act, which declared that discrimination in home sales and residential property rentals must end, minority homebuyers and renters routinely face discrimination. Single-race neighborhoods endure. The laws promise that no one in this country would ever again be denied access to housing because of his race or her race, religion, or national origin remains unfulfilled. Lower income and even middle income African Americans and Hispanics remain isolated, segregated, because they cannot live wherever they choose. I saw data the other day on Chicago that suggests that the lowest income of other ethnic groups live in a more free fashion than the highest income of African Americans on an index of segregation. The highest income of African Americans live more segregated, not by choice, live more segregated than the lowest income of every other ethnic group. It is not just a question of income. It is a question of functioning discrimination that continues to exist in our society. This discrimination is abhorrent to our most fundamental notions of justice and equality. But these fundamental American values cannot prevail unless the federal government resolutely stands for the rights of people. The federal government must not retreat from its historic role of protecting fundamental individual rights from local infringement. This we believe. So these then are some important working principles: helping people help themselves, the primacy of communities, guaranteeing and promoting real choice for people in housing and every other areas. These beliefs are translated into working values, quintessential American themes: families and children, decency, respect for norms, civil behavior, reduction of violence, less overt segregation. But to cross this bridge from belief and to action, the federal government has to change. The federal government must change. And President Clinton and Vice President Gore have directed those who are members of the cabinet to lead the change in our respective departments. HUD will change. We've proposed to consolidate some 60 separately funded programs into 3 broad, flexible funds that make the federal government a partner with communities. 60 different programs, specialized and competitive, will give way to 3 broad funds. Instead of having to apply with programs that have complicated deadlines and matching requirements and multiple planning requirements, communities will produce one coordinated, comprehensive plan and one set of responses for each of these 3 programs. We're in effect flipping the logic on its head. The logic that heretofore has said, if you have a problem, you must make it fit our programs. Instead, we want to say, you put together the strategy. You devise the local plan. You dream about the prospects for your community, and the federal government will stand behind you with flexible resources to help carry that out. Let's tap the full innovation and capacity that exists at the local government. Now, clearly, we have to be careful that we don't become just a check-writing machine, but I believe this kind of a strategy of decentralization, of simplification, of consolidation is very, very key to how we can make a difference in cities and communities. Secondly, we've proposed to transform the Federal Housing Administration from a slow-moving bureaucracy to an innovative entrepreneurial government corporation. What we're saying is we want to create a corporation in the place of what is now a 6,000-person bureaucracy, an entity of about 2,500 people with a handful of offices around the country, driven by a simple objective, a simple mission, and that is to create an all-time high home ownership rate in the United States. What we want to do is to achieve an all-time record by the year 2000 in the number of Americans who own their homes. The highest percentage we've ever achieved in the United States was in 1980, and that was 65.5%. In the 1980s, as we saw the denigration of government, that percentage fell. We're now about 2 percentage points under that. That means millions of people. But we believe a series of factors are converging in the 1990s. A strong economy through the end of the century, the reality of immigrant families who have been working at setting up businesses and now are ready to invest their savings in housing, and minority populations who have suffered discrimination, that if we could just reduce the levels of banking and mortgage transactions discrimination, we could increase their home ownership rate. We believe we can achieve an all-time high home ownership rate by the year 2000. What better way to celebrate the end of the Cold War and the use of America's wealth to put some resources in people's pockets than to create that all-time high home ownership rate. To do that, we'll need a stronger FHA. To do that, we'll need a Federal Housing Administration with a public purpose. Today, FHA insures 1 out of every 6 new homes. First-time home buyers account for 65% of FHA's home purchase borrowers. And FHA insures 2.5 times as many African Americans as all the private mortgage insurance companies put together. That is a powerful argument for a continuation of this important public purpose organization, FHA. And although there are those lobbyists for private mortgage insurers who are telling members of Congress today that they want FHA to be privatized, to sold off in pieces to the private mortgage insurers, the truth of the matter is that would not be in the national interest. Finally, the third piece of our restructuring of this entity to get it ready for the next century is to radically transform public housing. The simple fact is that most Americans equate the worst of public housing with all public housing. But unfortunately, in many American cities, the worst images of public housing are accurate. We see deteriorated buildings and declining infrastructure and wasted lives. High-rise apartment buildings that may have made sense in an earlier period don't work anymore. What we want to do is to deregulate public housing and consolidate the funding for public housing, and then to move in a dramatically new direction. Instead of funding buildings and bureaucracies and housing authorities directly by the federal government, let's fund families and let them make the choice as to whether they want to stay in that public housing or whether they want to seek housing in the marketplace with the certificate or voucher that they have. The idea is to change the logic of the system and put pressure on the housing authorities to perform. Today, we fund the housing authorities whether they produce or whether they don't, whether they maintain and secure or whether they don't, because we dare not take the money away. If we take the money away, we're taking money from people, and they will become homeless. But if we fund the people directly, they can make the same choice that everyone in this room makes about where they want to choose to live with that assistance that we can provide. It's a much better system than funding buildings to fund people. The truth of the matter is that I have, in the last 2 years as secretary, visited hundreds of cities across our country, large and small, and everywhere I've gone, I've seen urban communities in crisis. I've seen abandoned buildings and vacant lots where thriving industrial districts once stood. I've had some moments that I must tell you really break one's heart. To stand at a place called Hayes Homes in Newark, in the midst of a field that once was a playground amidst high-rise buildings, The field is empty, wind-blown, littered with glass, standing beneath a high-rise structure that is completely vacant. You can almost imagine the voices of children playing and laundry flapping and families conversing and moving to and fro in their business, but nothing. Emptiness, vacancy, except for the drug dealers who occupy the buildings. I went into one of those buildings with associates during that visit, and someone had notified the man who was doing drug business inside that people with suits were coming in the ground floor, and he rushed out of the building, not even having sufficient time to stash the stacks of cash in his pocket as he, jacket pockets, as he came out of the building. This is the reality of what exists in some of America's cities today. 2 weeks ago, I stood in Detroit this time of the night, Wednesday night, in Detroit 2 weeks ago, and spent an hour and a half going through the empowerment zone. This is a city that the people who were hosting me told me had the highest percentage of home ownership in the United States in the 1960s. And yet what I saw was block after block after block of vacant lots. Houses once were there, they'd been completely taken away. Entire business districts wiped out. I have never seen an instance which so clearly demonstrates the interconnection between the American industrial decline of the last years and what it means for people and for cities. What I saw in Detroit was the decline of the Cadillac plant. They drove me past a business that had closed in 1986, about a mile down one street, about 8 blocks across another, of width and depth of the world headquarters for Cadillac, completely closed since 1986, and the neighborhoods around it dead. A horribly sad story of what has happened to the industrial capacity of our country and what it has meant for these places we call cities. I've seen young men standing on the street corners in the middle of the day because there literally was no work. People say they ought to work. There's no work. I've been to neighborhoods where the women tell me that there are no shopping, there's no grocery shopping. You can't get there by bus. The cabs don't stop in these neighborhoods. If they're not fortunate enough to know someone who can lend them their car, there's no way to shop for groceries. This is our country. I've seen young teenage boys grappling with life and death decisions. Which gang should they join? That was really the only choice. Which gang should they choose? You make the wrong choice and you're dead. You're dead at 14 or 15 or 16. I wish this were a rare and exceptional story. Have we become so satisfied with the state of our union in 1995 that we can tolerate the idea of abandoning young people to awful choices like that? Our young people should be picking up a book or a band instrument, not a gun. They should be joining the football team or the drama society, not a gang. On the brink of the 21st century, we cannot walk away from these young people. I don't believe that when the American people voted on November the 8th, they were saying we should walk away from the young people who were born into a world where the odds are so heavily stacked against them. I don't believe that they were voting to abandon another generation of young people to horrible choices that no one of any age should have to make. I don't believe that they were voting for economic decay and unemployment without end for the people who live in troubled cities. I don't believe they were voting to push more men, women, and children into the streets to join the 600,000 of our fellow Americans who this night, at this moment, are settling down to the night on a sidewalk or a bus bench or in a shelter, homeless. At this historic moment, we've been liberated to question old assumptions and challenge old ways of doing business. We must seize the opportunity we've been given to make real and meaningful change. What we need today is the will to act on a new national vision of community, of support for families, and of partnership across the levels of government. We must learn from our failures and take heart in our successes. And we must never, ever let failure deter us from pursuing the possibilities. Today, we need more than ever the vision of a civil, compassionate society articulated by Senator Robert Kennedy 27 years ago on the night that Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. That night, Senator Kennedy had arrived in Indianapolis as part of his decision to run for president, March of 1968. It was 9 o'clock at night when he arrived there and heard the news that Dr. King had been assassinated. And he decided that he needed to be where people were. And so he went to the African-American neighborhood of the city. He'd been told that there were people gathering and there was a possibility of a disturbance. And so he went up on a flatbed truck that night in Indianapolis, seeking to ease the despair and quell the anger of the moment. And he spoke. Now, I've read many speeches of Senator Kennedy's, some written by speechwriters, others, no doubt, that he wrote, but I've never read one with as much force or power as the extemporaneous words he delivered that night from that flatbed truck. He said this: "What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not violence or lawlessness, but love and compassion toward one another, and a feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black. So I shall ask you tonight to return home, to say a prayer for the family of Martin Luther King, but more importantly, to say a prayer for our country, which all of us love, a prayer for understanding and for the compassion of which I spoke. We can do well in this country," he said. "We will have difficult times. We've had difficult times in the past. We will have difficult times in the future. It's not the end of violence. It's not the end of lawlessness. It's not the end of disorder. But the vast majority of white people and the vast majority of black people in this country want to live together, want to improve the quality of life, and want justice for all human beings who abide in our land. Let us dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man, to make gentle the life of the world. Let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and for our people." In 1995, let us remember the gentle, hopeful words of Robert Kennedy spoken on that grim night in April of 1968. And let us reject the cold words of those who would divide us anew. In this historic moment, let us remember who we are and dedicate ourselves once more to the vision of an America espoused by leaders across the years: James Madison and Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt and Robert Kennedy. A vision of a compassionate nation with room for everyone, and a heart so big that even those among us humbled by chance and birth and circumstance can aspire to the greatest dreams. Thank you very much for allowing me to be with you this evening. Thank you very much.
Yes, I certainly applaud your efforts and the Clinton administration's efforts to deal with the problems of homelessness and prevent it from growing worse and to lessen it. My concern is that some forces in this country are actually trying to criminalize poverty, such as in San Francisco. People are arrested for giving out free food, and there are various public ordinances making it hard for people to live who have no homes. I was hoping if you could address that. My friend Keith McHenry, who's been arrested 90 times giving out free food, will speak here tomorrow night.
Oh, interesting. Well, let me say first of all that our first priority at HUD is the reduction of homelessness. We have stated the priorities of the department for 2 years now in rank order, and number one is to reduce homelessness in our country. Some 600,000 Americans are homeless on any given night. The fastest growing segment of the homeless population in America is women with children. Thankfully, we don't see women with children on the streets that often. They're in shelters, but a shelter is no place to raise a child. And so, as we have made homelessness our first priority, we think that's appropriate. The department that is responsible for housing ought to deal first with those Americans who are completely unhoused. As we've worked at that, we have focused on a formula to address the problem. Homelessness, let me say, is a complex reality. It is not just about shelter. What the homeless people have in common is the lack of shelter. But there are many other aspects. About a third of the homeless population suffer from mental illness. About a third of the homeless population suffer from substance abuse problems. So unless we're integrating medical treatment and addiction treatment and job training and other strategies, we're really not going to permanently solve the homeless problem except to provide a person a cot and a meal for tonight. So we have embarked upon a strategy we call the continuum of care strategy that begins with outreach to the streets to bring people in, emergency shelter, supports to create more shelter beds, and we need them in most cities, assistance transitioning into the addiction treatment and mental illness systems, and then housing, transitional housing with supports and permanent housing. This is the continuum that we believe is essential to get a handle on homelessness. And we put, under President Clinton's leadership, we have better than doubled the amount of money available for homeless strategies over the last several years. It was $555 million when we came, $823 million the next year, and $1.7 billion is what we projected in this year's budget. We're not going to get it all because you've been reading about these rescissions that the Congress is imposing, taking money back. About $500 million of what I've just described was homeless certificates that were part of that equation. So our figure for this year will be about 1.1 instead of 1.7. But we've made a major commitment to try to address homelessness. Now, it is true that Americans are suffering what some have called compassion fatigue, just a real exhaustion with trying to solve complicated problems like homelessness. And the mayor of San Francisco basically was able to win an election because of San Franciscans' exhaustion with the previous mayor's efforts. And he's been very, very tough on homelessness. A program called Matrix, which literally routes people out of the parks and keeps people moving along the streets and so forth. Let me just, at the risk of seeming like I'm saying on the one hand and the other kind of answer, say to you that we must continue to focus on homelessness. I've already told you we made it our first priority. But I also understand that we must find solutions to the deterioration of public places that were never built to be sleeping spaces or places where people eat or urinate, etc., in the public domain. And so while I do not encourage programs like Matrix, that's a local decision that San Francisco has made, in fact what we encourage is communities to be more innovative about shelters and so forth and the solutions that they come up with. I do expect we will see more and more of communities simply saying, you cannot use this plaza permanently as a homeless encampment. You can't use this public park permanently as a homeless encampment. It's a complex problem, requires a lot of work. We're working closely with communities, but there is a balance that needs to be brought to the discussion as well.